All right, I will start. I'm Chris Gilbert. I'm talking to you from Arizona, Tucson, Arizona in the United States. I work part-time for the University of California in San Francisco. I'm going to talk to you today about breathing and emotion. One of my favorite topics. I've been a psychologist for decades, and I always had a soft spot for mind-body questions. My specialty within psychology has always been biofeedback, because it's a way to give equal time to both the body and the mind. And I'm fascinated by the mind-body interaction. It's a shame that we have to divide it up that way into one kind or another kind. But in some ways, I think of it as marriage counseling for the mind and the body. I'm not sure which is which, but there's a lot of interaction between the two aspects of ourselves. And some of the interaction is troubled and incompletely understood, and there's disputes. There's, of course, breathing is automatic. You'd be in a coma for years and still continue to be alive, but it's also voluntary. We can hold our breath anytime we like. We can breathe deeper or faster or slower, breathe more in the chest or more in the abdomen. We can breathe irregularly, slow or fast, through the nose, through the mouth. All these are available to us voluntarily. But if we take our attention away from the breathing, it does what it wants. And most of the variation in the breathing is either from exercise, demand for oxygen, or from emotion, which is somehow related to what might happen next. I think that's what happens to the breathing. When there's situations where a person is baffled by breathing symptoms, they call them symptoms because they don't realize it's from their emotional life spilling over into the breathing behavior. We have primate heritage, we have mammalian heritage, animal reflexes and animal triggers for changing physiology. It's like being in a self-driving car in which it can do very well by itself and you just be there as a passenger. But at any time, you can take over the operation of the car and hit the brakes or steer, whatever you want. Then you let go of it and the car goes back to driving itself. Okay, here we go. I have some slides. This I made years ago for a book in which you could look at all the different ways that the breathing is affected by these things on the left, the inputs: relaxation, anxiety, vocalization, preparation for effort, all the chemoreceptors acting on the brainstem. And the output is variable in terms of these things: breath, rate, depth, mouth versus nose, and so forth. These are all automatic, but we can intervene at any time. But when they are automatic, we are kind of out of the loop of why these things are happening until you start to get curious about it. And that's what I really like to do year after year, is help people who are having trouble with their breathing, don't understand why, and they think they need breathing exercises. And sometimes that's enough, but other times they need something more, which is an understanding of the emotional self that is affecting the breathing. Since I'm in the biofeedback trade, I can monitor breathing in many different ways. Muscle tension in the neck. I don't use this too often, but temperature of the air as it comes out the nostril goes up as you exhale, down as you inhale. Chest strain gauge is another way. Oops, sorry. Again, the circumference of the body, heart rate variability, and the concentration of CO2 as you exhale reaches a certain point, all perfectly normal, but a lot of things can go wrong with breathing that is evident in the CO2 changes. One of the early researchers to get curious about the language of breathing was Dudley. He worked in the 60s and 70s, maybe the 80s. And he wanted to develop something like a language of breathing, so that it's been done with facial expressions, so-called universal facial expressions that express very standardized emotions. And he didn't know about that quite yet, except from Darwin, but he might have had that in mind when he wired up people for breathing rate and depth and so forth, and had them think deeply about disturbing topics. And he would of course, ask them what kind of emotion it was, and they would tell him. He found quick conclusions that breathing volume increased when the person was thinking about action, any kind of anticipation of action, memories of action. The breathing got deeper. Thoughts of inaction, including depression, apathy, withdrawal, inhibited breathing. Anxiety increased the depth, increased the rate. Sometimes sighing happened. And it was a kind of a signature of certain people that they had a lot of anxiety and they had a lot of fast, deep breathing. But then there's also being on guard, apprehensive, waiting to see what happens next. That's inhibited breathing. So he came up with conclusions like that. He found, after all his years of observations, that irregular breathing often resulted from suppressing anger and suppressing guilt. Might have been indecision about how to feel, or two competing feelings perhaps. When he talked to people about their breathing symptoms, chest discomfort or dyspnea, so forth, they usually reported those symptoms happening as they talked about them. Now, that is strange. And he finally concluded that disturbances in breathing that are due to emotion are usually related to a conflict of some sort, a decision over taking action or not taking action. That's just disrupted the whole breathing regulation. Susanna Block was the next to come along as a semi-researcher. She was teaching acting students how to become able to project authentic feelings for film and stage roles. It's a small sample, but she did an interesting thing of monitoring their breathing and asking them to generate particular emotional states. And she just looked at what the breathing was like. I'll go through this quickly. Here's a sample trace that she says was pretty representative of many people. On the top, the breathing pattern is associated with tenderness. Nice and smooth and regular. Nothing threatening about it, no real action. Erotic love, on the other hand, kind of shallow sometimes, fast sometimes, as you might expect. Anger was fast and deep, as if you're getting ready for attack of some sort. And fear was jagged, erratic, suggesting a vacillation between one emotion and another emotion. Fifth one, 2, 3, 4, yeah, fifth one is joy, laughter. That looks kind of like tenderness up there. Smooth and regular, not too fast, not too deep. Here's probably when the person laughed. What can you do? Finally, on the bottom, a feeling of sadness. There's these jagged lines here as you breathe out. It suggests a wavering or trembling of the diaphragm that often is associated with crying. And here's kind of gas for air. And this was not people crying, but thinking of crying. The body was starting to reflect the feelings that they were generating on purpose. And here's some of the statistical expressions she made of these things. This is amplitude of breathing, respiratory rate, duration of the exhale, and the ratio of inhale to exhale. I won't go into these now, but they're always easy to look up. If you're looking for references to some of the things I say, I'll have an annotated reference list available either at the conference by email or you can write me later. Either way, I'd be glad to help you out with further reading. Pierre Philippot came along. He was interested in Susanna Block's research and wanted to replicate it. So he asked people to generate their own strong feelings like she did, and he monitored their breathing, a strain gauge around the upper abdomen, and asked them to generate a certain emotion such as fear. And meanwhile, he was looking at what happened in their breathing pattern as they actually felt fear. Irregular, shallow, thoracic, fast. Joy, very different, more abdominal, slower and deeper. When people generated feelings of anger, it got fast and deep, as if again, they're getting ready to jump into battle. Sadness was irregular, thoracic, more nasal. Excited joy was fast and deep breathing. Well, that was interesting enough because the majority of the subjects showed some variation of these patterns when asked to think of those feelings. So he's beginning to develop a kind of language of breathing. But then he did a very interesting thing. He reversed the order, which I mean, he asked people to follow a pattern such as these: sadness, fear, anger, joy. He didn't tell them what emotion was involved. He just said, go ahead and breathe this way. I'd like to see how well you can follow this breathing pattern. For joy, slowly and deeply through the nose, you're breathing very regular, ribcage relaxed. These are new subjects, by the way, not the same people who did the first study, because the second group did not even know he was interested in emotions. For anger, inhale quickly through the nose, breathe out, deeper than usual, irregular breathing. For fear, the top of your ribcage, breathe in and out, normal amplitude, irregular, so forth. For sadness. And he found that when people breathed in these patterns, they tended to feel, in 3 out of 4 cases at least, the feelings expected by the previous research topic. When the people generated their own feelings, they had long lists of adjectives to fill out and check off the ones they felt for each of these breathing patterns. Had no idea what the guy was studying. Joy, anger, and sadness were created in that person in response to these breathing patterns. Isn't that interesting? Okay, now we move on to okay. The point there was that there's a two-way interaction. You can go from breathing pattern, just manipulating the breathing variables, and you will affect the mood in some way. You can also start with the emotion, and it'll turn into a certain breathing pattern. Not 100%, but that we're apparently built that way. So when you're talking to a person just verbally about, just calm down, think of the beach, think of a nice sunset, think of the music playing in the background. You're on the beach in Hawaii. It's just words. There's no direction of breathing. As a result, their breathing usually calms down and becomes smooth and regular. On the other hand, you can ask a person, a new person, breathe kind of fast and deep, real fast and real deep, and they get agitated. Okay, now breathe slow and smooth. Count to 5 as you breathe out. Nice and slow, and they'll feel more relaxed. This is transfer from mind to body, from feeling state to emotional variables. There's not many other aspects of physiology that are that easily transferred from one domain to the other. Here's a statement by Ashley Conway, who's a British psychologist who studied hyperventilation a lot and used hypnosis to discover, at least sometimes, what their habit of hyperventilation and usually panic stemmed from. He concluded after a lot of this work and publishing about it, the initiating factors are often suppressed. That is, the actual social situation, the first time that they started to lose control of their breathing, they often could not remember that. So only the somatic symptoms remained. So they came into the doctor with symptoms without knowing where they came from. But with hypnosis, you could often unearth the origin of these symptoms. I have a couple examples of this. Wait, okay, I'll just talk about it. One was a woman I saw back in the 80s, I think, in New Jersey. She came to me with a request that I help her with her elevator phobia. And she explained that she just couldn't get into an elevator these days without feeling panic, feeling closed in, oppressed, confined, so forth. And she heard that I worked with anxiety. Could I help her? Well, I could have gone ahead with the behavioral approach of gradual exposure, put one foot on the elevator, take one foot out, stay in for longer and longer periods, talk to yourself, listen to a recording. But I got curious about where her anxiety about elevators started. So I asked her, where did it start? When did you first notice it? And it was at a time when she realized she could not get into the elevator to go to her in-laws. They were on a 4th floor apartment building. She came there with her husband. Of course, they were his parents. And she never felt that they approved of her. They were kind of sniffy about it. And you're wearing that, and that's not the way you hold that fork. That's what she reported. They're very disapproving of her. And she was married to their son. So she felt confined, limited, unapproved of. And one of those visits to the in-laws she could not complete because she couldn't get into the elevator because she felt a fear of the elevator. So we talked about it. It took several weeks of getting the whole story out, and she started to realize the feeling of confinement and restriction that she felt in the elevator was pretty much the same as how she felt visiting her in-laws. Same kind of feelings. Very interesting. And she was intelligent enough to think, well, this is not a coincidence. I think maybe I didn't have to visit them as long as I couldn't get into the elevator. And she felt it was more respectable to have a genuine phobia than just not to want to be around her in-laws. She finally discovered that she could go in other elevators. She was avoiding all of them, but she could go into elevators that did not have her in-laws at the top of the 4th floor. And so the whole thing kind of fell apart. She saw through the attempts her mind was making to help her out of this bad situation. Fascinated me, at least. The second case was a woman whose husband was taken to the hospital, and it was a minor cardiac incident, they called it, but they asked him to stay for about 2 weeks of observation, just stay in the bed and eat the hospital meals. And the wife was, of course, concerned. She went every day to visit him. But after about a week, he was starting to say, this is not so bad. They feed me breakfast, they feed me lunch, they give me snacks. They'll come play a game of cards with me if they have time. I joke around with the nurses. I don't have to do anything here. I may never go home. Well, this was said in jest, I hope, but she took offense at that because she had a lot to do at home with the kids and maintaining the household and driving every day to help him out. And he was already pretty happy not being home. Well, there was some rage there that was not quite acknowledged, but she developed a phobia of driving. She could not drive more than 3 miles from home, she said. And she got to her physician. The physician referred her to me because he knew I worked with interesting cases like that involving anxiety. And she reported a lot of hyperventilation too. She had to pull over to the side of the road. She was dizzy, chest hurt. Well, the whole ball of wax. So I asked her if she could drive more than 3 miles in other directions, like to go shopping. Well, yeah, I can, I guess. I don't know why. Then I asked her, how do you feel about your husband being so happy in the hospital? And she just kind of blew up. He's awful. He's there flirting with the nurses, and I'm taking care of the house, and I don't know what to do about it. Well, some part of her did know what to do with it. It gave her a phobia for driving. And in his direction, she could drive more than 3 miles in other directions, but she could not drive herself to the hospital to take care of her husband because she was mad at him. And when she realized that, she kind of gave up the symptom and decided she's going to talk to him about it. And that was quite a story. Okay, now I move to the idea of reflexive response to something. You've all been at concerts in which the microphone is brought too close to the speaker, a terrible howl, noise, squealing. This is because the sound coming out of the loudspeaker is being picked up by the microphone, amplified and sent back to the loudspeaker. And before you know it, there's a howl, acoustic howl. The solution for that is to get the speaker and microphone farther apart. This happens in anxiety attacks all the time. Call it a vicious circle. The same principle. If you get anxious about symptoms such as overbreathing, feeling if you can't get a deep breath and something wrong, you're feeling dizzy, lightheaded, that causes anxiety, which feeds back into the breathing dysfunction, back and forth, up and down, more anxious, more anxiety about the symptoms, more symptoms. And it reaches a plateau eventually. It usually disables the person when they feel they just have to sit there and tremble until someone gives them a Xanax or something. White coat hypertension works kind of the same way. If you're afraid of getting a bad blood pressure reading, you have to go on pills like your Uncle Joe does. You don't want to see yourself that way. The more anxious you are about that blood pressure reading that the doctor takes, the more likely it is to be high. That's another vicious circle. It's a kind of a body phobia, your fear of something going wrong in your body. To deal with that, I help people to understand the sequence, and with biofeedback can hook up maybe heart rate or breathing or muscle tension or something, have them think about the anxiety problem, and show them how the body is right there with them, right alongside or reacting as if it's real. And if they do some lowering of that signal, whatever it is, slow breathing or muscle relaxation, along with talking to themselves about the fear of the symptom is unnecessary because they can control it directly. Once they see that biofeedback screen, they have an extra bit of power over the body's responses to their emotions. And then we talk about changing the emotion, whether it's reality-based, whether it's a cognitive error, so forth. But the vicious circle, I just love to see them because they're fairly easily remedied. If there's trauma history in a person, it's really important to work with if you do work with breathing, because it's bound to be really kind of catastrophic breathing if a person is physically threatened. And sometimes if they're at a party rejected by everybody, they made fun of, something like that, that'll affect the breathing too. And that experience, the somatic and emotional linked together, can be reactivated by any associations that remind the person of that original experience. And they may not remember the experience. They remember only the last time it happened and how distressed they were. It's body anxiety instead of looking at the whole picture. All these memories are stored in the amygdala and the brainstem for usually the duration of the person's life, ready to pop up and warn the person if something is starting to happen again. So it could be a smell, a piece of music that was playing during the trauma, a person, a context. I always ask about, in cases of breathing problems, near drowning history, or almost suffocating someplace where you're locked in a closet, you're locked in a basement. Did anything go wrong with your breathing? But I have to go very carefully in these cases because I don't want to reactivate the whole traumatic experience in my office when there's 7 minutes left of the session and then somebody else is waiting in the waiting room, things like that. It's hard on a person to be pulled back into a memory that they've been pushing away. So I asked gently, is there something in your past that might have involved your breathing somehow? Maybe there was a close call or an intense fear. Maybe you were treated badly. Just close your eyes and think about your breathing in that context. I don't need for you to tell me what it was exactly. Just give me a nod if you think there's something back there that might have started this breathing problem. And about 2/3 of the time, they will make a connection to something, either they knew it before or they're discovering it with my gentle prodding. Another point, when you're experimenting with breathing, having them breathe in a certain way, a certain depth and so forth, this might trigger a reoccurrence of that traumatic response. If you happen to have them duplicate, okay, now take a nice deep breath, fill your lungs up. Now push it out, push it out. Maybe that's what they did when they were attacked by somebody. Who knows? So you have to be always careful about the edges of a trauma starting to show. And if you're monitoring some of the things I can do in biofeedback, you can see the body starting to get upset. Person might deny being upset, but I point to the look at your heart rate's over 100. You came in with about 75. You're breathing kind of fast up in the chest. Something is trying to get to your consciousness, don't you think? You don't have to tell me, but just notice how the body is being affected by your emotions. So, okay. So I discovered the vicious circle, the traumatic response. There's so much more to say about these things, but I have at the most 30 minutes. Two big points I want to emphasize. Well, three really. Alienation from the body is a really common feature of anxiety attacks. I mentioned the body phobia, a fear of what could happen if the symptoms continue. You're alienated from your own body, as if this is a marital spat in terms of the marriage council model. You have to get those parts respecting each other and talking to each other. You can't make the body talk except through its physiology. But you have to educate the person a bit about how strong these emotions are in affecting their body and creating symptoms. Another point is that, well, for me at least, breathing is a very good way to access that mind-body interface. It's so sensitive to changes in a person's emotionality, and I can look at that breathing change and relate it to the conversation and maybe the history. And it's really, if you're in a psychotherapy role, or if you're just curious about a person, the breathing will give an advance warning of something about to blow up perhaps. Then of course, there's the two-way interaction from the body to the mind, from the mind to the body. It's very hard for us to see a person as a single whole with an aspect of physiology and an aspect of subjective consciousness. But they all have to get together for life. One cannot exist without the other. So if you can help to modify their reaction toward their breathing, I think that's at least as important as modifying how they're breathing. It's the emotion entangled with the breathing that really makes a difference. I think I'm out of time now. So let's say goodbye. We'll have a discussion, I think later on today, if the schedule holds. You can ask any questions you have. Okay, thank you for listening. So long.